officially welcome everybody who's watching or listening. I'm Brian Dorian or Snappy from the PIVX community. And it's awesome to have Mr. Fuzz or Fuzzbawls, if you are in the Slack channel, on the line. He is one of the, I guess you would say, core developers for PIVX. I had the pleasure of actually getting to meet him out at one of the meetups recently that happened in San Fran. And so from that, there was discussions about getting people just to experience the developers on more of a human level, right? Like we see their awesomeness from the tech side. So this is the first of hopefully many endeavors into the PIVX developers and what that's like. So thanks for doing this. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, glad to be here. And we've talked about this for a couple of weeks now, and good to finally get on the line with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess to start, how did you? I mean, we'll go through a bunch of questions, but how did you? I guess get into cryptocurrencies, right? Like that's probably a question that a lot of people want to know is what was that path like for you?
Okay, so I was living south of San Francisco, back in like 2008 to 2010, and I had a buddy that worked at Apple that one day when we were out at a bar, he said, "Hey, have you heard about this thing called Bitcoin?" And I said, "No." "Well, what is it?" And he goes, "Well, it's like digital money." And we talked about it for a little bit. He didn't really know what it was either, and obviously I had no clue. This was, probably mid 2009 at that point. And the conversation just kind of lasted for the night, and it didn't really progress any further than that. And I was, doing completely non-tech stuff at that point in my life. I was doing a lot of traveling. I was practicing a lot in the arts. And so I didn't really give it much more thought. After that initial conversation, it just wasn't an interest of mine at the time. And I think this was before the whole Bitcoin pizza incident, so that there was no value associated with it at the time.
Yeah, I was going to say that's pretty early on in the lifespan of Bitcoin. If you heard about it back then, that's very early.
Yeah, this was pretty much right after the whole idea came about.
Wow.
And he heard about it through someone else at Apple that was big into the whole tech scene and just happened to catch a glimpse of it being mentioned. And I think at that point, I don't think a whole lot of people really knew what it was. Certainly not what it could become and what it eventually did become.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so that's really interesting. You said at that point you were, that was going to be my second question is how long you've been in crypto. So that's sort of like the nexus at that point. So interesting. You said at that point you were involved in the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Graphic arts, fine arts.
Fine arts and specifically photography.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was traveling around, all over, the Western United States and a couple other countries around the world, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico. And I was doing that primarily.
Okay.
And, kind of segueing into how did I get into crypto? Well, I moved over to New Zealand in 2011. I was still doing a lot of the arts back then. And that's what I was doing in New Zealand, living as a photographer over there. And through, unfortunate but not unforeseen circumstances on the home front, back here with family, I needed to move back. So I moved back home to California here, and I was looking for some way to basically, make a living, and worldwide travel was kind of out of the question at that point. So I started thinking back with back to previous conversations, previous connections that I had with people in the tech industry, and I remembered, hey, there was that thing called Bitcoin. So did a quick little Google search, and by that time it was early 2012. So it had obviously taken off quite a bit.
The landscape was a little different.
Little is an understatement of the year right there. So yeah, and I had always had a lot of tech background, web dev systems and network administration. That was what I did before going into travel and art. Spent my days in a server room and cubicles, running around large campuses, taking care of computer issues and network issues. So the tech background was already there. Looked into it a bit, bought a little bit, not a whole lot. Obviously, I was just getting back from living abroad, so didn't have a whole lot of money to invest.
Yeah.
But then started looking into the code a lot more, familiarizing myself with how it all kind of went together, and noticing, obviously by that point, this vast altcoin market, which, from looking at the code bases and the tech, it was very obvious that there was quite a big gap between where Bitcoin was on a code and tech level and where many of these altcoins were, and that exists to this day still. There's a huge gap.
So that's interesting. So that's I'm going to jump in, because what you just described is something that I would speculate and venture that most people in cryptocurrency today, right, altcoins, etc., you name it, aren't really aware of that, right? And I would sort of throw myself halfway into that group, right? Like, I'm not used to going into a GitHub repo, reading through code. I can make sense of some things, but being able to have that analytical, quantifiable mind to say, hey, this is like garbage code, or this is actually legit. So what you're saying is there's a lot of the projects that still exist really don't have that level of, I don't even know what you want to say it, that level of development going on within their actual endeavors.
Yeah, you could say development. You could also say, in some regards, code maturity.
Okay.
One of the issues that I come across actually repeatedly with altcoins is their use of what's called peer discovery. How does that wallet find other nodes, other peers to connect to? Well, way back in 2009 to 2010, Bitcoin was using IRC, Internet Relay Chat. And it was a method where the client would actually connect to an IRC server, get a list of other users in a specific chat room. Each user was another client.
Wow.
So it would then ask for their IP address, and it would try and connect, to the Bitcoin network through that address. Well, it was discovered not long after it started being used that such a method was insecure. It could be, breached upon. A malicious actor could most certainly get into those IRC channels, because IRC is an open network, and start relaying false or malicious data. So Bitcoin did away with that method of peer discovery. If you look at a lot of altcoins, even coming out as recently as, I just looked at one that launched this month. I'm not going to name a name, but
Sure.
Still using that form of peer discovery.
Interesting.
Even though it's been deemed as insecure, unsafe, and whatnot.
So is that an issue that largely comes down to sort of legacy code that was in initially, that subsequent updates of the Bitcoin core took care of. And so if people are doing, I don't know what you would call it, like a clone, that code is just being basically ported into those projects.
That's exactly what's happening. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Wow. So then I guess for you, going back into that moment when you were exploring, hey, there's this whole altcoin field, right? Like there's all of these altcoins coming up. What was then your process as you were getting familiar with the code? Where was the tipping point for you to actually start jumping in with projects, right? Like you going from hey, I'm looking at this as a hobby / getting up to speed on the fringe or on the cusp, the cutting edge of where things are going to, hey, now I'm actually working with a cryptocurrency or a project. What did that look like for you?
For me, it started off with, freelancing. There were a lot of projects back in 2013 to like 2015 that they're springing up all over the place. There's a new coin being released basically on a daily basis, and they're all using kind of like that cloned source and following a couple guides that somebody had written at some point in time, and just basically spitting out the same end result, and that end result usually involved a Windows wallet, and that's it.
Yeah.
The project leads, I'll call them, because more often than not they weren't actually developers themselves. The project leads had no clue how to actually compile the client for Linux or for Mac or for any other operating system that wasn't explicitly detailed in this one guide that had been reformatted and reworded across the internet multiple times. So I started out freelancing with doing wallet build services and release authoring, and that's really where I got into working with other projects. It was completely contract based. I would just get a one-off payment, typically in Bitcoin, to where I would produce the actual downloadable wallet binaries for whichever operating system they wanted.
Yeah. So you got a lot of experience hands-on with I would say different flavors of project leads, different iterations of a code base, etc. Just by nature of you kind of getting yourself into that position.
Oh, of course.
Wow. So then that I'll save a question, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was the lead up to what you just described, right? Binary release, the binaries being the executables, downloads, etc. That process. So we'll pause that because I think I'd love to know how you got introduced into the entire PIVX community. Like what was that like for you? How did that come about?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit of a backstory with how I got introduced into PIVX. Back in summer of 2015, I was doing volunteer work, producing binaries and cleaning up a little bit of the, at that point, outdated code in a project called Mintcoin. And in August of 2015, PressTab was also contracted to do some work on Mintcoin. He was contracted to set up a hard fork that so long ago it fixed something with the rewards, I believe, and so he and I kind of worked together a bit on that. We were both at the time, independent contractors, just kind of each doing our own contracted job. It wasn't so much of a team,
Yeah,
like it is with PIVX. But he and I stayed in touch after that, and he's got his own projects. He's also at the time he was an independent contractor, and he still is. And we both kind of just had our own independent contracting things going on. Well, back in February of 2017, browsing around on GitHub, and I see a notification in my message in my little notifications area on my account. It says, PressTab has created a fork of PIVX. I go, what the hell is PIVX? So I kind of looked into it, and I saw the some of the base features, it being based primarily on a much more recent version of Bitcoin Core that would be anything at or above Bitcoin Core 0.10. And that was really intriguing to me because it was a very welcomed reprieve from dealing with coins that were based on primarily Bitcoin like 0.7.
Yeah.
It was mid 2013, so quite dated by this point. So it was refreshing to see that. So I looked at it, and back then they were looking at I think it was wallet version 2.1.6, but there was some issues with getting some of the binaries done in a timely manner. So I threw in a pull request and got a couple issues fixed up just completely voluntarily, and that was my introduction to PIVX.
Wow. So then PressTab's also, you mentioned his name. He's also one of the developers with PIVX.
Yes.
So it's sort of I guess within those realms, it would be safe to say that the developer pool is probably pretty close knit. Like I would imagine you have a good sense, especially if you've been in since 2012, 2013. You probably, I would imagine, you get a sense of who's who doing work. I'm sure there's new people coming in all the time, but I would say some of the old heads are pretty well known.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously mentioned PressTab, but I also had conversations and dealings with 7hacks prior to PIVX as well. Nothing on a contract level, but he and I had, talked a number of times, just kind of in passing.
Which is so cool because I guess especially with crypto, it depends on where you are, but for the majority of the population that consumes, trades, etc., cryptocurrencies, this subset of the population, which are the core developers, often, I don't want to say they're like enigmas, but it's a total different realm, right? Whether you're anonymous, pseudo-anonymous, right? Like whether you're Satoshi or Fuzzbawls or whoever, the developers are, there's still this air of, you guys just do magic stuff, right? Like you do these things, and then I press a button and download goes my wallet, right? So, so that's the lead in. This is the question of, I'm dying to know, because like in PIVX, we just went through, there's a mandatory update actually tomorrow, right? August 21st. So whoever's watching this, if you haven't update it. But yeah, what is it like from a developer's perspective that goes into what I would say like a major release of a wallet?
Well, okay, so going in from, or transitioning from, just a random, contributor to a specific issue that PIVX was having back in February, to my position now as someone that's actually part of the core development team.
Perfect.
One of the things that I made a big push for during the first initial couple months of being part of the actual team was a much more structured release process. I didn't want to fall into the trap of having releases be something that were done on a whim, or having releases that could not be verified with a very specific commit in the code history. So the way that the releases work right now is that we obviously get pull requests from, outside contributors, and core developers themselves also make pull requests into, the main repository. It's very, very rare that any of the core developers, even though they have the ability to make a commit directly to the master repository, even though they have the ability to do that, it's rare that it happens. And one of the reasons for that is having a clear workflow history. Now you see the pull request, you see the discussion on the pull request, you see that someone has either tested it, acknowledged it as being okay, or that they've expressed a concern, and that concern has either been addressed, fixed, or the whole idea has just been thrown away.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So when we get to the point where we have enough, features, fixes, changes, whatever it may be, that constitutes an actual official release, we then start what's called the release process, in which that any kind of new user-facing wordage, strings as they're called, anything that you see in the UI, that gets sent off to TransFX. That's our primary translation portal for both the desktop wallet and the Android wallet. So all that gets sent off. Usually we like to give at least a week's worth of time for any translators to submit those strings into whatever native language they happen to be writing for. And then the translations are pulled back into the master repository. From that point, the code for, say, 2.3.0, it's fixed at a specific point in time. And every single, build, as it's called, that references that point in time is going to produce the exact same result. Now, it usually takes a couple days after that to get the actual binaries done and released to the public. Main reason, go ahead.
So binaries are like if I go to PIVX.org and I go to wallet download, right? And you see the .exe or whatever those are, that's a binary, right?
Yeah, binary is a technical term for just a program, an app, an executable. The terminology varies depending on what operating system you happen to be running.
Sure.
But yeah, that is what the binary is. It is the file that the public downloads.
Yeah. So you said it takes a few days to go from the actual commit, say, okay, code's now locked into place, to having those files.
Yeah, and the reason it takes that amount of time is the way we make those files is done in basically an isolated environment. We have all of the supporting code, supporting libraries that they're not actually part of our code base. They're usually like system provided things, like for Windows users, it would be like the C++ runtime. No Windows end user is going to really care what that is, but it is still important to have because without it, these types of programs just wouldn't function.
Yeah.
Any user that uses the graphical wallet, what you see, the windows that you see, that's all built on a library called Qt. That's a third-party library that basically allows for the design and the functionality of everything you see in the graphical sense. So we have to make sure that all of those kind of supporting libraries are consistent We don't want to have a situation where Windows works, but Mac doesn't, or
Sure.
Linux works, but Windows doesn't.
You don't want the people up in arms saying why is my software not supported, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have had a couple minor issues to that end. 2.3 actually did rectify an issue with the graphical client on Linux, mainly because Linux is a lot more strict about certain things.
Sure. So right now, currently in PIVX, when there's a release, the changes just for the general public, you can obviously we'll be posting anytime there's wallet updates. It'll be on pivx.org. It'll be tweeted. It'll be in Slack, on Facebook, etc. Ongoing, right? So.
Oh yeah.
So when you say like for example, the version 2.3 to update, right, by August 21st, what happens on that date, right? Just for clarification, because some people might be asking, well, what happened to my coins? Like if I forget or if I didn't know, et cetera. Because again, it'll happen. So at that point, what happens, and will users be able to rectify to say, hey, I can upgrade after this time?
So in the sense, or in the case of a mandatory update like 2.3, or if you think back, 2.2 even was a mandatory update. What that means is there is a new incompatibility. Older versions won't recognize either a new consensus rule or a new way of processing, say, like how the client connects to another client.
Okay.
And so when 2.3 was released, that was released just under 2 weeks ago, 14 days ago. All of the new rules are included. So if someone had updated 2 weeks ago, they're running all the new code that's going to be running after tomorrow.
Gotcha.
They already have it. What tomorrow does is basically just say, okay, we've had enough time to update. We've got to start implementing some of these new consensus rules on a more strict level. The consensus rules have already partially been in effect. And I'm actually happy to say that it hasn't caused any issue as far as I've been able to tell. However, there still is a chance that an old client could, be in a situation where it doesn't respect a new consensus rule. So the deadline tomorrow is basically just saying, okay, we've had enough time, people have updated. Let's avoid the situation where an old client can cause a conflict in consensus.
Okay. That makes sense. So then the new consensus group continues forward, and at that point, if you're running an old client, I guess it's not that you're on your own. You're basically not part of that major consensus moving forward, right?
Correct.
So you could then, at that point, still back up your wallet, download the new client version 2.3, and then regain the major consensus. It's just, I guess, at that point. So, like, let's say you're staker, you're not going to be. I guess at that point you'd be on your own, right? You're not part of the major consensus, so you're not going to be staking.
You could technically still stake if you don't update by tomorrow. However, much like the situation when 2.2 came out, if you do continue to stake after the update deadline, you're going to be off on your own.
Okay.
And with all this talk of forks and whatnot in the crypto space this past 2 months, basically, would this technically be considered a situation of like PIVX versus PIVX Classic? In a very minor sense, yeah, it could. However, to support any kind of, non-standard chain or fork of a chain, there actually needs to actually be support for it.
Sure.
And, 10 people staking off on their own isn't really what you would call support.
Yeah.
In that sense, you wouldn't be able to do anything with those staked coins.
Yeah. So that's it's an interesting. We'll segue a bit because I know there's a couple community members working on a white paper or purple paper about network security within a proof of stake coin, and especially within PIVX, right? What makes PIVX unique from a network security standpoint. So look for that coming out soon. So I guess so if you don't mind, we'll transition though. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is for you, what is PIVX for you? As a person, right? Yeah, you're a coder and developer, but you're a human being as well. So yeah, what is PIVX for you?
For me, it's in a word, opportunity. A little bit more expansion on that, opportunity to quite literally change the way people interact financially. It's no secret. Anyone that's spent time talking with me probably knows that I consider the traditional banking systems and fiat to be broken and have a limited lifespan left in them. We've seen, at least here in the United States, we've seen breakdowns happen very recently in history, and nothing has actually been fixed. The cause of those breakdowns has not been fixed. It's just been, slap a Band-Aid over it and hope that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
So PIVX is an opportunity to get away from some of those broken systems. And, we've seen with like the recent meetup in San Francisco, just how vibrant and just how passionate some of the members of the PIVX community are. And I mean, that's just icing on the cake.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's opportunity, it's community, and hopefully it's a drive forward.
Awesome. So I guess we'll get ready to wrap at least this segment up. I'll do the corny probably last question, right? What is one thing that people in the PIVX community or crypto community at large, and whoever's listening to this, that they would never know about you? Now, obviously, since you're a pseudo-anonymous developer, there's probably a lot of things that you can pick. But in general, what's one thing that most people? I mean, already the fact that you said, for me, you are doing photography, right, and traveling. I mean, that's phenomenal. But if there's something else that you wanted to pick to say, hey, what's one thing? I'm a human after all. What would that be, or what would you like to share?
Well, you hit the nail on the head right there. I already answered that question earlier. Being in the arts, being in photography, doing the traveling thing. That's something that up until today, I don't think hardly anybody in the crypto community knew about me.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, that'll be it for this segment. I wanted to personally say thank you. Again, it was wonderful getting the chance to meet you out in San Fran. But for those who weren't at the meetup, hopefully that this was be informative for everybody, for the crypto community. Again, and your handle in Slack is at Fuzzbawls, and you are very active. I know I see you all the time in Slack as well. So yeah, if you guys have questions, etc., don't inundate him too much because we need him to be doing work. But yeah, no, thanks, man. And looking forward to seeing and chatting more. So
yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, if anyone does happen to send me a message on Slack and I don't respond, don't take it personally. I pop in and out of Slack quite often throughout the day, and sometimes I need to focus more on work.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool.
All right.